Okay, so this is Chapter 15, Restorative Justice for Juveniles, and this is going to be presented by Serena, Emma, Lynn, and Rachel. So to start off, what is restorative justice? Restorative justice represents a shift in society's response to crime. The criminal justice system usually involves two parties, government and defendant. The victim and/or members of the community impacted by the said crime are usually used as witnesses. This policy recognizes and involves victims in the community as participants in this process. It considers who was harmed by the crime, what is the nature of the crime, and how can the harm be restored. Continuing on, restorative justice promotes the reintegration of victims and offenders into their communities. Programs are focused on reparation of harm, assisting the victim, offender accountability, and protection of the victims and all involved in the crime and its aftermath. Some of these programs include victim-offender dialogue, group conferencing, circles, and community boards. Restorative justice creates a positive peace in communities and societies instead of an ineffective and negative peace based on strong police presence, incarceration, and further disintegration of committees. Community justice is a subsection of restorative justice, and it refers to all variants of crime prevention and justice activities that explicitly include the community in their process and set the enhancement of community quality of life as a goal. The key elements are viewing the community as an active agent in partnership with traditional justice entities, taking a problem-solving approach to enhancing public safety, building a relationship within the community, and evaluating based on community outcomes. Fixing a community and the quality of life for people living there is the ultimate goal. The 5 principles of restorative justice are focusing on the harm caused by the crime, especially to the victim and the community, seeking to repair the harm caused, accountability for repairing harm involving all stakeholders, and restoration of the offender, victim, and the community.
So we will be talking about juvenile delinquency and restorative justice. So the development of effective programs and interventions to reduce juvenile recidivism is a national priority. Juvenile criminal offenses are a significant societal problem with great financial and societal costs. Adolescent boys commit higher rates of criminal acts than any other age group and use much of the resources of youth service systems. Traditionally, the juvenile justice system in the United States is dominated by 2 different approaches. These approaches are the retributive justice model and the rehabilitation justice model. While the retributive and rehabilitative model focuses on the punishment or rehabilitation of the offender, they neglect the needs of the victim. Youth who become involved in the juvenile justice system at any early age are significantly more likely to continue offending than their older counterparts. Estimated that 6 out of every 10 children ages 10 to 12 referred to juvenile court will return. The risk of becoming a serious offender, for example, is 2 to 3 times higher for child delinquents ages 7 to 12 than for youth whose onset of delinquency is later. Because very young offenders are more likely to reoffend and to progress to serious delinquency, effective early intervention is crucial. Early offenders pose special challenges, but restorative justice offers unique benefits. Not only does restorative justice hold youth accountable for their actions, it also affords them the opportunity to repair the harm they have caused, involving their families and victims in the process. So the first kind of start of restorative justice was the victims' right movement. So the victims used to be witnesses of offenders. Witnesses or offenders would pay their victims for restitution. And victimology was created in 1960, 1970. And victimology is the recognition of crime victims' rights to information from the prosecution about the cases against the person who had harmed them. Consideration of the impact of the crime on them during the sentencing. This is achieved through victim impact statements. This is the opportunity to be heard during proceedings involving the offender, the opportunity to receive reparations, the provisions of direct services to the victim's needs, and the prevention for further harm during prosecution. And then a victim offender reconciliation program was created, but many of the victims felt pressure to accept reconciliation. And then, due to concerns of victims feeling pressure to accept apologies and felt harm if they did not, creation of more restorative justice programs focused on victims' needs. So, mid 1990, the balanced and restorative justice approach was created by the United States Department of Justice to provide best practice modules for implementation which address the needs of victims as well as the juvenile offenders. In 1994, the American Bar Association approved criminal justice policy on victim offender mediation/dialogue, recommending adoption and course including victim and offender. And then after much changing of how restorative justice should be implemented, um, people no longer saw this as a policy that contradicts the victim feelings, but still want to advocate for those victims to protect them. So the first source is family group conferencing and reoffending among first-time juvenile offenders, the Indianapolis experiment. So this was performed in Indiana. So young first-time offender youths were randomly assigned to either group family conference or one of several court-ordered diversion programs. Nearly 800 youths participated in the experiments, and the cases were tracked for 24 months following their initial arrest. Given the consistent findings of victim benefits in restorative justice process, the results suggested that conferences hold promise as an effective intervention. This was at least for young first-time offenders. It had high levels of satisfaction among all included in the family group conferencing. And then compared to the control group, the ones who were involved in family group conferencing had lower recidivism rates. And then the completion rate for those who were included in the family group conferencing was 80% compared to 61% of the control group. The second source is effectiveness of restorative justice principles in juvenile practice, a meta-analysis. Overall, the results evaluating restorative justice programs and practices showed a moderate reduction in future delinquent behavior relative to more traditional juvenile court processings. Youth participating in restorative justice programs had a greater perception of fairness. The results also suggest that restorative justice youth are more satisfied with the restorative justice programs and have somewhat less supportive attitudes towards delinquency. And victims reported improved perceptions of fairness, greater satisfaction, improved attitudes towards the juvenile. They are more willing to forgive the offender and are more likely to feel that the outcome was just. My last source is Restorative Justice Conference as an early response to young offenders. This is the Indianapolis Restorative Justice Experiment. So it incorporated restorative justice principles, which are inclusion of affected parties, respect for all participants, and an emphasis on problem solving. Victims received apologies and reparation agreements, including other mutually agreed upon actions. These characteristics translate into high levels of satisfaction among victims. Restorative justice conferences successfully address the needs of many victims of offenses committed by the youth. In addition, findings show that conferences are a promising early intervention for youth first-time offenders. And then given the high rate of reoffending among very young children who enter juvenile court, these findings are encouraging and support the need to continued experimentation with an assessment of the restorative justice conference approach.
So my first article is Restorative Justice Dialogue, the Impact of Mediation and Conferencing on Juvenile Recidivism. The source says that restorative justice is highly effective, especially when it comes to victim and offender mediations. There's been about 1,300 programs that have been established and used in 18 countries, and it has a high satisfaction rate of about 80 to 90%. And then family group conferences, or FGC, is popular in the US, Canada, and South Africa and Europe. And peacemaking circles are the primary goal to promote accountability, healing, and compassion through community participation in resolving conflicts. And then there's a large support for victims' needs, and offenders are held more accountable as well. And my next source is Receptivity to Restorative Justice, a survey of goal importance, process effectiveness, and support for victim offending conferencing. So there was a study of 207 adults that responded and took a questionnaire online about their youth, and it was based on all backgrounds and races. And it found that victim offender conferences, or VOC, is the most effective aspect of restorative justice. Overall, the article states that restorative justice is better than the eye for an eye ideology that we have right now. Having someone take responsibility for their actions in a positive way is better than if they were to in a negative way. And this can reduce the reason for recidivism in the future because these juveniles are growing, maturing, and learning right from wrong in positive ways. And it found to have effective low recidivism rates and administrating impactful apologies to victims. And the needs for more positive support through the media as well for restorative justice and the whole victim offender conferencing too. My next source is Restorative Justice at Work, examining the impact of restorative justice resolutions on juvenile recidivism. There was a study done in Maricopa County, Arizona, juveniles, and it looked at the data through the court system, and it analyzed to see the effects of the restorative justice. The study concluded that juveniles in restorative justice programs reoffend less often than juveniles not in restorative justice programs, and they reoffended less than juveniles in other programs than the restorative justice. And the article cited Braithwaite from 2002, and it said that having an impactful apology can give a sense of security, empowerment, forgiveness, and reconciliation, and that's one of the most emergent values for restorative justice. And having an impactful apology is what makes or breaks the effectiveness of restorative justice. And the article also argued that understanding the source of crime is highly important to actually stop reoffending.
So my first article was called Restorative Justice, Communities and Delinquency, Whom Do We Reintegrate? So this study focused on empirically evaluated data that influence community characteristics on reintegrated programs. So the study used juvenile court data to examine individual and community data influencing the selection of offenders to restorative justice programs. And this also helped determine if the program impact in different varying communities was working. The quote I have is recidivism is modeled with individual and community level data. Within the study, juveniles who successfully completed the program were less likely to recidivate based on the data collected. Additionally, recidivism has little to no variation in programs across different communities, so that hypothesis was supported. This study also emphasized the need and usefulness of community-level data being incorporated into restorative justice. The program needed to be specific to the populations and community characteristics. So essentially, that hypothesis that they first had was supported because they learned that the programs were not effective if the specifications of the programs were not to the population and community of the people that it was being used for. What works for one community doesn't always work for another community. My second article that I had is called Are Restorative Justice Conferences Effective in Reducing Repeat Offending? So the objective of this study was to analyze the effects of repeat offenders in 10 random trials of face-to-face restorative justice conferencing. So the researchers analyzed 159 studies and 10 were selected for this data collection due to the recidivism measured at 2 years after conviction rates for the random assignment. And this study concluded that face-to-face restorative justice conferences are cost-effective in the regards to reducing the frequency of recidivism, and ultimately, restorative justice conferences were cost-effective in treating and preventing repeat offenses as presented by these randomly selected participants. So this next article is actually a critique of restorative justice. It is called A Review of Restorative Justice Responses to Offending. They analyze data to either confirm or deny if restorative justice actually helped individuals from reoffending and what benefits the victims got from participating in restorative justice programs. So this study found little evidence that was deemed reliable enough to determine that restorative justice reduces reoffending. Additionally, victims that were surveyed are normally satisfied with restorative justice programs, but not able to be compared to those who take the more traditional court route because their satisfaction levels are not recorded. Additionally, public opinion seems to be in favor of restorative justice as a practice, but the evidence again is very minimal. One thing that did come out of this that was positive and in support was that it analyzed the cost and efficiency in the process compared to court style cases, which, as I said, are more traditional. The restorative justice programs appear to be less expensive than traditional court costs. However, again, the data is not considered substantial to these researchers. And I do like to point out that this was a overall study in both juvenile and non-juvenile restorative justice programs. So there is not a distinction between those two in this article. And then my final article is Restorative Justice, the Evidence. And this study really just proved that restorative justice works differently on different kinds of people, very similar to the first article that I had. It can work very well as a general policy if a growing body of evidence on what works for whom can be used as the basis for specifying when and when not to use it. They did test restorative justice in diverse samples, and they found substantial reductions in repeat offending for both violent and property crime. Other tests have failed to find such effects, but with different populations and interventions or comparisons, it did work. In a specific circumstance done in Australia, they offered face-to-face RJ, and it appeared to have caused higher rates of have caused higher rates of repeat offending, but this was in adult offenders. And they did find that restorative justice can be used as an alternative to incarceration for young adult offenders who had a much lower 2-year reconviction rate in a Canadian study than those who served their time in prison. So the takeaways from this is that restorative justice does not serve the same effectiveness or purpose for non-juvenile offenders as seen in the study from Australia, but it does work for young adult offenders or juvenile offenders as seen in the Canadian study.
My first article, Review of Research on Victims' Experiences in Restorative Justice, assumes that restorative justice is victim-centered. It also analyzes research that focuses on negative experiences of victims as outliers. And the heaviness of the research on restorative justice measures shows that they can be effective in mending damages and discovering significant types of justice for people who are involved. And with a greater focus on young offenders with the ultimate goal of rehabilitation, this is often at the expense of victims, unfortunately. So the steadiness of outlier discoveries and restorative justice research recommends that deliberate approaches might be expected to keep track of quality, guarantee restorative justice practitioners are prepared, and diminish underlying pressing factors that will, in general, make restorative justice methods less victim-sensitive, less cycle-arranged, more offender-focused, and outcome-driven. And to clarify, these are all approaches that should be taken into account to ensure the effectiveness of restorative justice. And regarding juveniles, it is argued that effective restorative justice results might be related with their acknowledgement of the effects of their impacts on others, expanded compassion for the individuals who have been hurt, and the dynamic advances they take to fix harms by genuine efforts to offer peace, right their wrongs, and transform their lives. The second article, Restorative Justice in Prisons, Methods, Models, and Effectiveness, focuses on efforts to use restorative justice within prisons. It also notes that restorative justice is more suitable for juvenile offenders and their victims, but not for serious offenders and their victims. So many potential benefits of restorative justice in prisons include prisoners getting significant perspectives into their effects of deviant behavior and build empathy for those they hurt at the same time. They can also get opportunities to make amends for their past mistakes through restitution and reparation with efforts to repair themselves. And restorative justice has the potential to meet a lot of victims' needs, but if these are not met, then they can hold back recovery from crimes trauma. And the biggest potential restorative justice has is the reimagining of imprisonment. And the only big concern really is the financial costs. Unless we focus on lasting detainment, we are left with the issue of individuals getting back into society coarsened and embittered by their experience in prison. The purpose of this review, examining the effectiveness of restorative justice in reducing victims' post-traumatic stress, was to analyze the restorative justice's effectiveness in decreasing symptoms of post-traumatic stress that arise following victimization. So in an adolescent sample, restorative justice supported improvements in mood and cognition. And the juvenile victims who took part in the restorative justice reported greater rates of agreement when they were asked if the offender had taken proper degrees of obligation regarding the occasion compared with victims that received standard justice. This result demonstrated those in the restorative justice condition had less exaggerated fault on themselves or others for the criminal incident. The same study also found that participants who experienced restorative justice communicated fewer negative thoughts about the world and had more prominent confidence for the future. So taking everything into account, it has been proposed that restorative justice is an alternative way to deal with criminal justice that can improve PTSS in victims of crime. And the procedures enacted in restorative justice are missing from other types of criminal justice, which gives the approach qualities that can create psychological benefit for victimized people.
So, one of the theories that we have connected to restorative justice is deterrence theory. This comes from the classical school of criminology, and this is where people can be discouraged from acting poorly if the consequences outweigh the benefit. The main ideas of deterrence theory are severity. So, the punishment must be severe enough to offset the pleasure of committing a crime. Swiftness, if they know how swift the punishment will be, they will not offend, or how quickly they are punished after the crime. Certainty is the apprehension and the promise of the apprehension that and the certainty that the punishment will be carried out as prescribed. And other concepts from deterrence theory are free will, which everybody has the ability to make choices about their future actions, such as when to offend and to not offend, along with the ability to be rational. So most people have the ability to see what the outcome of their choices will be. Hedonism, which we must desire more pleasurable things than harmful ones. It is more probable that crime will be deterred if all three of these elements are in place within society. And participating in restorative justice programs deters juveniles from committing more crimes.
So my article was extending deterrence theory. There was a study conducted on 9 high schools in Columbia and South Carolina, and the data was collected through interviews of these students that were all taking regular English class in the years of their 10th, 11th, and 12th grade at the very beginning of the year. There were 2 waves, and in between the 2 waves, there was about 1,625 students that were in both of the waves. And out of looking at all that and the conclusions, juveniles that have peers are delinquent have a better understanding of the punishments, so they understand the swiftness and severity more, and this kind of deters them from committing a crime. And they have a heightened certainty of punishment, so from seeing their peers or friends offend, they know that they will get a punishment for doing that same crime. And juveniles that have delinquent friends and peers are more likely to be sanctioned, which means they're more grounded and they know that they shouldn't do those things because they saw what happened to their friends or their peers. We should be conscious, though, that 51% of the participants in this survey or interviews were females, and 85% of them were white, both male and female. And overall, juveniles were found to have more deterrence when they had a delinquent friend or peer because they saw the severity, swiftness, and the certainty of punishment from their peers.
So the article Restorative Criminal Justice says that deterrence theory assumes rationality, and it is doubtful whether the severity of the punishment affects the future behavior of offenders in certain types of offenses and certain segments of the population. And according to restorativists, shame is what actually deters individuals from committing crimes. And according to Braithwaite's reintegrative shaming theory, restorative justice gives a more personal and efficient deterrent since it builds a space within the local area, shames offenders for their deeds while communicating their concern and taking responsibility for them. So the combined message of denunciation of the wrongful act with the acceptance of the wrongdoer enables the offender to reintegrate into society after having taken measures to repair the harm caused by the crime. And offenders who participated in restorative justice measures detailed sensations of fairness, mindful listening, impartiality, and the ability to have an impact, which encouraged them to satisfy their efforts. Restorative justice is, for the most part, more proficient than the criminal process in lessening recidivism rates.
The effectiveness of various restorative justice interventions on recidivism outcomes among juvenile offenders. This study examined several variations of a restorative justice program for juvenile offenders. These programs were direct mediation with offender, indirect forms of victim offender mediation accomplished without direct victim offender contact, the use of community panels, and a group who received only minimal interaction with restorative justice staff. Developing and implementing programs that can lower juvenile recidivism rates is an important policy challenge, and results not only support the effectiveness of restorative justice programming as compared to traditional juvenile court processings, but also suggest that each type of restorative justice intervention, even those that are minimally involved, for example, indirect mediation by the program facilitator, reduces recidivism risks related to juvenile court proceedings. So offenders don't want to harm their victims again or harm the community again.
Another theory that we use to explain restorative justice is labeling theory. So labeling theory is the efforts to control crime often have the effect of increasing crime. Individuals who are arrested, prosecuted, and punished are labeled as criminals. Others viewed and treat these people as criminals, and this increases the likelihood of subsequent crime for several reasons. Labeling will influence their behavior. Individuals who are labeled delinquents or criminals are stigmatized and are likely to take on a deviant self-identity and become more rather than less deviant than if they had not been labeled. And restoring the relationships with the community and victims harmed will decrease labeling theory.
So the first article is the conditional impact of official labeling on subsequent delinquency, considering the attenuating role of family attachment. The study examines how the effects of a criminal label on recidivism vary by the degree of warmth and attachment found in the family environment. The authors use ordinary least squares regression and a product term analysis. The authors tested their hypothesis using the data from the Children at Risk program, which contains a sample of high-risk use. The results indicated family attachment, examined across several waves, significantly diminishes the harmful effects of a criminal label. Results suggest that warm, supportive parents can reduce the likelihood that their child will reoffend. Then the second article is measuring the contextual effects and mitigating factors of labeling theory. The authors examined 3 ways that the official intervention may lead to secondary deviance. The 3 ways are self-concept, pro-social expectations, and association with deviant peers. They examined a sample of labeled and non-labeled individuals, just like the other article, using data from the Children at Risk study. So based on the based on a view of a 3-year panel of 677 randomly selected juveniles, ordinary least squares regression shows that official intervention with the criminal justice system leads to an increased delinquent self-identity, decreased pro-social expectations, and an increased association with delinquent peers, which then leads to an increased likelihood of engaging in delinquency again. The results from the current study suggest that a program which combines case management and mentoring may be beneficial in reducing the likelihood of criminal behavior following the formal labeling process.
So my article was building social support for restorative justice through the media is taking the victim perspective, the most appropriate strategy. So overall, the article says that in order for restorative justice to be effective, we need to stop labeling juveniles, and labeling juveniles is harmful to regulate the actions of youth. And if we label juveniles, they will then accept that they are a criminal and then continue to reoffend since they already have the criminal label placed on them. And instead of worrying about labeling these juveniles, we need to focus more on the victim offender mediations. Doing this, we can keep the communities together and reduce the rate of reoffending as well.
The study, Juvenile Victims in Restorative Justice, analyzes the fulfillment of juvenile victims partaking in conferences or courts, contrasted with the fulfillment level of adult victims who took part in reintegrative shaming experiments, also known as RISE. So typically, young victims expressed that they were satisfied with the manner in which their cases were taken care of, felt they had sufficient authority over the process and were dealt with fairly, and expressed that the interaction was useful for them. There was one conference that was held between Gina, a 17-year-old, and Betty, a classmate who assaulted her. And leaving Gina emotionally and physically scarred, she placed a restraining order against Betty in fear that she would assault her again. Both the girls had 2 friends supporting each other in the conference, which was remarkably youth-led. And although there was much conflict and rejection of Betty's apology at first, the conversation eventually helped clear up rumors. Can you go back, please? Thank you. The atmosphere became friendly and humorous, and the conference ended with both parties satisfied with its outcomes. So the RISE study showed that conferences were altogether more fulfilling than courts for both offenders and victims. The conferences that were unsuccessful may be due to the sense of not having control of the way the case or the conversation is driven. In measures that follow victimization, having some level of control over the process and its results may give a powerful coping factor to victims in their healing, and this is valid for child victims as well. Teens specifically favor essential control techniques in an attempt to influence their circumstances. And in the event that a restorative justice process is uncontrollable, for example, when one of the members dominates the conversation, then victims may be worse off, either on the grounds that their efforts to assert a few primary controls are pointless, or if they saw the interaction as uncontrollable to begin with. So having control in the conversation and conferences leads victims and offenders to not have a sense of labeling each other because they get to mitigate their own issues together and see each other's point of views rather than have the courts or someone else dominate their own issues.
Overall, restorative justice is an effective policy for juveniles. For adults, research was mixed. More programs and research are needed for adults. Restorative Restoring the relationship between victims, the community, and the offender will deter the juvenile from reoffending. Juveniles see the damage they cause and the people they hurt and do not want to do it again. Labeling juveniles will cause an increase in wanting to offend. Restorative justice helps the juveniles realize their worth and that if they apologize, they will no longer be looked at as a criminal.